Welcome to Boomstick Gaming, this is Alex, and today's advanced combat guide for Ghost of Tsushima will be focusing on mastering stances. The 4 different stances alter your heavy attacks mapped to triangle, which are most effective against certain enemy types, and once mastered, you can start to string together combos that can seamlessly flow through each. Some might assume going into this that your stances are altering your light attacks since its attack animations seem to vary, but in fact your light attacks play out somewhat randomly from the same pool of attacks, not dependent on what stance you're in. For that very fact, from here on out, I will be completely focusing on the stance-influenced heavy attacks only for demonstration purposes. I will also be sticking to one stance at a time to try to properly showcase it, instead of swapping to the correct stance according to the enemy class I'm up against, which is what you should be doing in normal or hard mode play, which the latter is what you'll be seeing in the gameplay throughout this. Now to get this guide going, I will be showing all the possible upgrades for each stance to maybe help you pin down which ones to focus on leveling up first, as well as explaining some of the pros and cons of each to try to figure out which one is the best general all-around stance in the game, with a few bonus combat tips along the way. So let's get to it. First off, the strong stone stance. The stone stance's swordbreaker attacks are fairly quick vertical swings, with little forward steps between each to help extend their distance. The charge attack, piercing strike, has really great reach and is good for starting or finishing combos. Before moving on any further with the stone stance, really fast, something that actually applies to all stances is quick priming your heavy charge attacks. As you can see here, a fast tap of triangle plays out your regular heavy attacks, but if you press just for a few frames longer than a simple tap, you can launch into a charge attack quite quickly, without most of that charging stall animation. Now taking a look at the upgrade path for stone stance, the first improvement is puncture, which is a more basic version of the charge attack I just previously showed. Then, Strength of the Mountains, which will improve your stagger damage against swordsmen, the main enemy type you'll want to use stone stance against. Followed by Full Puncture, the extended version of the charge attack Piercing Strike. And lastly, the most important, Momentum, which just flat out increases the speed of your heavy attacks. Although I don't want to spoil showing any of them here, the structured boss fight style duels in Tsushima, which seem to have many swordsman opponents at least towards the start, make stone stance super effective in those fights, especially if you have the upgrade Momentum, which will easily chew through their stagger gauges. Also with that upgrade, stone is one of the only stances that has heavy attacks that rival, if not surpass, the speed of some of your light attacks, making it very good for general combat. Although its charge attack Piercing Strike has a pretty slow startup before it hits, if you get the timing and spacing of it down, it can be very useful for hitting enemies that would normally be just out of reach. Overall, Stone Stance has what I would consider to be the best sequence of heavy attacks if you upgrade it, but the charge attack can be tricky to pull off consistently, especially with the faster hitting swordsmen rushing you down. Next, the Flowing Water Stance. Water's basic shield breaker strikes can be somewhat slow to start up, but with their wide sweeping style, they can sometimes hit multiple enemies clumped up close together. The Flurry Strike is a personal favorite that harnesses the more destructive properties of water, inflicting huge stagger or raw damage if ever hit lands. Another quick little tip here again that works for every stance is timing charge attacks correctly mid-combo. If you notice, when I tap the attack button and then immediately tap and hold again to initiate a charge, it will not actually log that second input, leading to the combo ending right there. However, if you pace yourself and wait till right after the moment your animation would impact with damage, roughly midway through the attack, and then press and hold triangle, you can then immediately flow right into your charge attacks. Looking at the upgrade path for water, it starts out with Flowing Strikes, a shorter version of the charge attack I was just showing. Then Strength of Tides, which boosts the stance's effectiveness against shielded enemies. Next, Surging Strikes, which is the really good finalized version of Flurry Strike, and lastly, Downpour, which just flat out boosts the effectiveness of that same move, which is the high mark of the stance. I found Water to be just as all-around reliable as Stone stance, but I found myself actually using this more thanks to its much better charge attack, just having the downside of slower standard heavy attacks. Even against non-shielded opponents, this would still whittle down stagger gauges quite efficiently, and landing every hit of the Flurry Strike almost guarantees you'll break most enemies' guards. Combining Water Stance's strong attacks and the power of Flurry Strike in conjunction with your already fast standard light attack moveset proved to be a great combat synergy that I found myself usually using as my default stance when initiating battle. Next, the elusive Wind Stance. The Wind Stance's initial heavy strike has a super slow startup animation, but it covers a huge range, making for a decent way to close the distance while attacking. The charge attack is the Typhoon Kick, that can be used to knock enemies into hazards, off ledges, or can just be used for effective crowd control. Heading into the Wind Stance's upgrades, we have the Strengthened Typhoon Kick, which knocks enemies back a little further and increases its stagger damage. Next, Strength of Gales, which improves stagger against specifically the Spearmen. After that, Spear Defense, which automatically parries incoming spear attacks when using wind strikes. And finally, Typhoon Kick Finisher, which knocks down enemies after you land that kick. Like I mentioned before, this is the primary crowd control stance of the bunch, outside of just being super effective against those pesky spearmen, and sometimes just a good old-fashioned kick to the face is a great way to assert your dominance at the start of battle. The kick is, however, primarily for inflicting stagger, not damage, and sadly, it's a lost cause when going up against a bear. The standard heavy strikes for this stance are a double-edged sword. While although strong, the slow startup might get you hit more often than you would like when trying to start off a heavy combo. This makes for a good stance to use sparingly in conjunction with your light attack moveset, using the heavy strikes to finish off combos, and having that kick in your back pocket at all times to thin the herd, giving you time to reevaluate the situation. The Wind Stance overall is not the most practical of the bunch, but it sure is fun to use that somewhat comical kick. Lastly, the ominous Moon Stance. The Moon Stance's standard heavy strikes are less about dealing damage and more about inflicting stagger, especially on the large brute class enemies. The charge attack Spinning Strike is exactly how it sounds, and will put you into a somewhat risky rotating slash. This can be great against groups, but does have some serious downsides I will be getting into. Looking at the Moon Stance's upgrades, we have Whirlwind, the two-part form of Spinning Strike. Next, Strength of the Heavens, which increases stagger damage against brutes. Then, Finishing Strike, which makes the final hit of your heavy attack string deal greater damage. And finally, Tornado, which is the three-part form of Spinning Strike. Unlike the other stances where a simple tap of the heavy attack button will usually yield some kind of decent damage, the Moon Stance is much more about inflicting stagger instead and getting to that big final hit of its heavy combo, which can do some serious damage if timed right after the kick breaks someone's guard. This makes the heavy strike somewhat tricky to make effective against non-brute enemies, but that is where the Spinning Strike gains a little bit more usefulness. I wanted to go into this singing the praises of Spinning Strike since it's just flat out satisfying to use, but since you can get hit during the entire animation, not to mention how little it interrupts oncoming attacks, makes it mostly a really reliable way to get yourself killed. This is not to say it's necessarily useless, far from it, but it does require a certain finesse and timing to it in order to use it without putting yourself in harm's way. Moon Stance overall is decent, but does have some shortcomings when compared to the other stances, but also just like those, is still vital for taking down the stronger enemy classes that are weak to it. Those were all 4 of the stances and their corresponding upgrades in Ghost of Tsushima. On a side note, if you have yet to unlock all the stances and you're trying to amass them as soon as possible, make sure you're being stealthy and actually observing enemy leaders whenever the opportunity arises. If you simply watch them practicing the moveset of a stance, this will give you a full tick towards learning it, and you can then kill them as well to earn double the knowledge towards that corresponding stance. Pretty useful. Now to close all of this out, let me know if you found this guide to be helpful at all, or if you've already pinned down your favorite stance already, let me know which one is your go-to samurai pose. As always, this has been Alex from Boomstick Gaming. Thanks for giving this a watch, and I'll be seeing you next time.